just to draw a thought for sharing a testimony with you all today, I'd like to read from Psalms chapter 8, verse 4. And the scripture says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him, that thou, or the Son of Man, that thou visitest him." So we could just draw a short thought from that scripture. What is man that thou art mindful of him? And, to be mindful means to remember in one sense. In another sense, it means to care for, like a man that is mindful of the needs of his family and to take care of those needs. And so, you could read that scripture like, "What is man that thou rememberest him, or that thou carest for him?" And it's a great statement. Sometimes it's hard to think of God as a loving Father, but the scripture says that He has not given us a spirit of fear, but a spirit of adoption, whereby we can cry, "Abba, Father." Abba, Father is a meaning or a significance of intimacy. Some people perceive Christ as someone they only see on Sunday mornings in church. But He's as close as you put Him in your heart. And there's that intimacy that comes with that relationship with Christ. And as for me, I really had no interest in making a reputation for myself. But I do like to talk about Christ and how I met Him and what He means to me. And if I can share that, in a few moments with you all here, then, I'd like to do that. So, I'm born a member of the Seneca Nation of Indians, one of the tribes of the Iroquois nations, and from western New York. And my father, my story starts with my father, who was born and raised in the Allegheny Mountains, along the Pennsylvania state line in western New York. And he comes from a community of Seneca that were part of a chief that they had called Corn Planter. And the name Corn Planter means the man is known by what he plants. And to some plant discord, some plant peace. And he was given that name because he was a caring person, cared for his tribal members, and he made provisions for a better life and their welfare. One of the things he did was, this chief he allowed Quaker missionaries to come in among his tribe, his community, and teach them reading and writing. And their textbooks were the Bible. And so there was Christian influence that he brought in among his tribe. And I think my father would have been like the fourth generation from that community. And it goes to show you how far-reaching the hand of God can be. From this community to my father was like, he might have been the fourth generation out of that community. But he lived Christian testimony before me and my family, my brothers and sisters. And we, as a young man, my father was, he told me that his mother died when he was 3, and his father died when he was like 13. and his sisters were sent out to family to be raised. And at 13, he went out into the world to, make his way in the world. And he had maybe a second grade education. And one of the things he found out about himself was he was quick with his reflexes. He had quick reflexes. He was quick with his hands. So one of the things he did was he became a fighter, a boxer, and he would fight anybody for money. And he would travel with like circuses and carnivals, and he would care for the animals. And then when one of the ways he brought money into his pocket was he'd fight anybody for money. So he did that, and it was a hard lifestyle that he lived. And one of the things that came out of that was a drinking habit, and resulting in his loss of sight, and at a very young age. And he ended up in a poorhouse in Buffalo, New York. And poorhouses were for people that had no place to go in life and no way to get there. And he wasn't even 30 years old, and that's where he ended up. And he told me that when he reached that point in his life where he lost his sight, and he didn't know how he was going to make a life for himself or what options there were in life for him, and he refused to live under other people's charity. And he told me that he thought about ending it all. It was a very low point in his life, and but I think he was too young, and he was too much of a fighter to give up on himself, even as bad as it got for him. And fortunately for us, we weren't even born. But he ended up in this school for the blind, and he had to learn how to live all over again. He had to learn how to write his name. He had to learn a profession that he could use his hands without, his eyesight, need of an eyesight. So, he had to learn how to live all over again, And, but one thing through all of that was he held on to his faith, what he was taught and what he believed. And when everything was stripped away, that's all he had left. And so he made a life for us. My mother and him were married and started a family. And he made a life for us, the two of them together. And my mother wasn't a believer, and my father was Christian. And I don't think that in our household you could find two more opposite beliefs. My mother was traditional Seneca belief, my father was Christian, and the two do not go together, but they found a way to live together, and they found a way to have a family and to make a life for us, a good life for us. My father worked in furniture upholstery, a trade that he didn't need his sight for, and the jobs he did weren't real high-paying jobs. So, as a family, to keep food on his table, we always had a garden. We lived off the land, hunting and fishing, and we all had to pull our weight plus the weight of our siblings, and we learned to care not only for ourselves but for the rest of our family as well. So, thinking back over the years, those years as I was growing up, it was a hard life. But it was a very good life. I have many good memories of my youth. and I never felt deprived or anything like that. But one of the things, I remember my mother, she became his hands and his eyes, and they bought a house and they started framing in a house to expand it as the family was growing. And one of my first memories of my mother was, she had a framing square and a saw and pencil and hammer and nails. And my father would tell her how to frame in the floor joist system. And she'd get the saw out, and I remember her working, and, she'd drive nails and everything. And then I remember seeing my dad climbing between the floor joists and, inspecting her work, making sure she had enough nails in the floor joists and system and all that. And they worked together as a team. And, we helped out. I was too little at the time to be of any help, but that's how I remember, the family as a unit working together. And, we made a good life. It was a good life that we lived. When I was about 7 years old, I remember meeting Christ. And I was playing on a dirt pile in our backyard. And I remember being aware of an unseen presence. And I remember that first meeting. And what I remember of that first meeting was the sense of love and fear at the same time. And it's not the kind of fear that you're going to be harmed, because there's nothing about him that's going to harm you. But I just never got used, even to this day, never got used to him being in his presence. And that goes back to the very first meeting that I had with him on that dirt pile as a little boy. And I remember when he left, I could tell you which way his spirit went when he left. And I stood on that dirt pile and I looked out in a direction on the horizon where his spirit left. And I said out loud, I said, I know there's a God out there somewhere. And one day I'm going to know him. And that pull that I felt when he left is still with me even to this day. And sometimes in situations in life, that I'll feel that. And sometimes it's very subtle, like almost imperceivable, but it's there nonetheless. And that's how he leads me through different situations. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you are a fisherman, but when you put a fly out on the water and you feel a tug on it, a real gentle tug, and you think, is that a fish, or is that just a current, playing with my lure? And then you pull on it, just to see if there's a response. And you see that, it's almost imperceivable like that. And then, it's just like he's grabbing my shirt and he's pulling me real gradual like that. And that's how he leads me sometimes in situations. And I still feel it to this day. But it started on that first meeting. Over the next several years, there were 2 other meetings, and they came in a similar fashion. And with each meeting, I got to know a little bit more about him. You never get to know him all at once, And then I got to know a little bit more about him with each meeting. And it was the basis of a relationship, looking back now. And is a relationship that I have with him even to this day. So, it's... I remember after these 3 meetings, then there was nothing. For years, there was nothing. Never heard from him, nothing. And I used to, my mother and father, we were never made to go to church. We were never made to participate in the Iroquois ceremonies. But my brothers and I, we did both. We participated in both. And I remember, as a child, I remember being at my grandmother's house, and she was raised in that belief, the traditional Iroquois belief. And like during the winter, I remember being at her house during the winter, and the new moon in January was always the New Year's ceremony. And the Iroquois have what they call the False Face Society. You know, they carve a face and then they mask themselves with it for their ceremonies. And I remember there was being at my grandmother's house, and the snow was knee deep. And I remember seeing a string of men coming from the longhouse, you know, wearing their false faces. It was the False Face Society. And they came through the snow, and my grandmother would let them in a house. And we were little kids, and you know, and she would let them in a house, and we would go run and hide. But you know, you can't hide too many places in a two-room house. But they would come in a house, and they would have their turtle rattles, their horn rattles, and go around the house shaking. There'd be chanting and singing in the Seneca language, and then there'd be speaking, and we'd be hiding, and these false faces would be going through the house, and then I guess what they were doing was they were chasing out bad experiences from the living space, things that had gone wrong or during the year. They were erasing all of that so that the new year would start with a clean slate. And then my grandmother would pull the ash bin off from underneath her stove, her wood stove, and it had all the wood ashes in it. And the false faces would gather around it, and there would be more singing and chanting, and then they would take their walking sticks and they would stir the ashes in her ash bin. And what that signified was a new beginning. And you know how you can rekindle a new fire, a new flame from old embers? And that's what that symbolized. You know, a new beginning, a new fire, you know, for the new year. And then my grandmother would give them money, and then they would leave, and they would go to the next neighbor's house and do the same thing in the next neighbor's. And that was one of the opening ceremonies for the Iroquois New Year's ceremony celebration. Then it was, you know, storytelling. You go to a longhouse, and there was storytelling and social dancing and ceremonial dancing and like that. So you know, I know what that is, and you know, at a very early age, when I used to participate. We used to do what they call a feather dance, and it's a demonstration of agility, you know, balance and strength. And you put a feather on the floor, and then there's a ceremonial dance that goes with it, and then you pick it up with your mouth without touching the ground, other than just your feet, you know. And it takes a lot of agility to do that. So I remember participating in that. But you know, at a young age, I always had something in me that would pull me, like I explained. And I knew that there was nothing for me there in that belief. And even though it was my heritage, and even though, you know, part of my family, one side of my family was steeped in that upbringing and in that belief, yet I knew there was nothing there for me. There was something more. So I kind of shied away from it, you know, and I remember my brother and I would take turns, and we were maybe early teenagers, and we would take turns walking my blind father to a church service that was within walking distance of where we lived. And I would go one week, my brother would go the next week, and you know, we'd sit through this church service with my dad, a Presbyterian church. And I remember sitting in a Sunday school class, and we would all sit around in a circle, neighborhood kids and my peers. And my older sister was one of the Sunday school teachers. And we'd have to memorize scriptures, and we would have to stand up and recite those scriptures from memory, among our peers. And we all had a turn as we run around the circle like that. And I remember having to memorize and recite John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And I remember having to recite that, and for some reason, which I couldn't explain at the time, something about it sounded familiar, and I didn't know why. And then you see, that was after those initial meetings with Christ, and then there was years of silence, nothing. And then when I began, like say early teenager, reciting that verse of scripture, struck something in me. Somehow I knew that sounded familiar, and I didn't know why at the time. And that was Christ revealing himself to me in his word. See? And then I remember a brother who would become my father-in-law. I didn't know it at the time. But he started holding tape services at his church. His church was struck by lightning. The building was over 100 years old. The Presbyterian church said, it's too costly to fix it. So they just abandoned it. So it sat empty for almost a decade, I believe. And then one day I met a man who was looking at the hole in the roof to see if he could fix it up. He fixed it up at his own expense, and he started holding tape services. And he told how God had sent a prophet to our generation, and that he had heard him, and he started holding these tape services for Brother Branham's ministry we were following. So I had heard the message, and I had heard tapes and like that. But I remember hearing the message entitled Hybrid Religion. And in there I remember he talked about, Bill Branham talked about traveling. And he was in Nebraska, I believe it was, and he saw a field of corn, like 7-foot tall corn. And he, at a rest stop, and he walked out there and looked at it, and he pulled the ear off the stalk and peeled it open, and he said that, he said, boy, that sure don't look like the corn that we grew back in Kentucky. And he found out it was what they call hybrid corn. And he said, for as good as it looks, he said the kernels had full kernels on the ears, top to bottom, and they were just packed in real tight. And he thought, boy, that sure don't look like any corn that we raise. But he said, you find out that with hybrid corn, that it only is good for one generation. And as good as it looks, it doesn't have any life in it. And the reason for hybriding, is, how every 3 or 4 generations a corn crop will have a bumper crop, a bumper year. And what science is trying to do is to create it so that they have bumper crop every year. But in that process, they alter the life in the corn to the point where it can't replicate itself. It's only good for one generation. And he said, they've done the same thing to the Word of God. And that just hit me like a 2x4 across the forehead. And I remember hearing that, and I walked up to the brother and I said, that is nothing but the truth. And what that process was Christ revealing himself to me in the context of this message. And I knew right then and there that, you know, like I told him, I said, that you can't say nothing more than it's the truth, absolute truth. And I believe that to this day. I hold to that. So you see, it was a progression from those first early meetings with him as a child on that dirt pile, and then to quoting scripture in Sunday school class, and then to hearing that message on hybrid religion. You see, he was leading me progressively into a deeper relationship with him. And I've had that relationship with him to this very day. And I remember one time, you know, when you're a kid, you think nothing bad's going to ever happen to you. You take chances and risks, and you do things. You go on adventures and never giving any thought to danger. And one of the things we used to do was we used to make rubber rafts out of tractor tire inner tubes, and you know, in a sheet of plywood. And my friend and I, in the neighborhood that I grew up with, we used to watch the creek that runs through our reserve. And when the water was high enough, then, you know, we could put that raft in a river and go down 7 miles to the next town and get picked up. And that was our adventure for the afternoon. So we had a thunderstorm one time, and they put the creek in flood stage. And we used to navigate by pushing poles off the bottom of the creek as we navigated through the river course. Well, this water was so high, we couldn't touch bottom. And we were at the mercy of the river. Wherever the river sent us, we couldn't navigate the river in this high water, and it was fast. So we came to this one place, one stretch in the river where a tree had been undermined and fallen into the river, and we were headed right for it. And when we hit the tree, just before impact, my friend who was in the front of the raft jumped off onto the tree trunk to save himself. The raft became unbalanced, and I flipped over with me into the creek in flood stage in this fast water. And I remember being in the water like being in a spin cycle in a washing machine. I remember being tumbled through all this white water, and you know, I couldn't get a sense of which way was up. And I remember like, which way do I go to get to the surface? And I was just being spun in the water like that. And I was running out of air. And I remember locking my jaw because I knew that if I breathed in, it'd be all over. And I was getting dizzy from the lack of oxygen, you know, and I found myself in a state of someplace between life and death. And I remember a peaceful feeling coming over me, and something inside of me said, everything's going to be okay. And a peace came over me. And this real, almost euphoric, peaceful feeling came over me in that state, somewhere between life and death. And I remember saying to myself, or thinking to myself, you know, so this is what it's like to die. It was peaceful. It's nothing to be afraid of. And I gave up. I was fully well ready at that instant to meet my Maker. And I just gave up. I just went limp in the water like that and was ready to meet him. And next thing I knew, I broke the surface of the water. And we had a small inner tube that we used as a life preserver, such as it was. And that was right in front of me, and I threw my arm through that, and I went under again. But I came back up, you know. And I was still dragged down the river at least 200 yards before we'd come to shore. That's how And you know, water is a powerful force, force of nature. And try as hard as you will to resist it. You can't. Try with all your strength. You can't resist the force of water. And I was totally at his mercy. And you know, but yet he gave me a peace. Being in that state, he gave me a peace and he delivered me. So, you know, even though being on death's door, he still delivered me. And, you know, I still had to fulfill the plan of God, is how I look at it. You know, it was God preserving his word for something higher. But, you know, all the times, you know, in a relationship that I have with him, he'll let things happen to me, or he'll put me in circumstances where I have to call out to him. But he always lets me know that he's with me, and he gives me that confirmation. And so, you know, by his will and by his design, I'm able to be here with you this evening. So, on the what I was sharing this morning over breakfast was a story of how, you know, I came to hear the message. And there was another tribal member who, during World War II, was a drill sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps. And he used to take civilians and turn them into Marines. And he was also a veteran of the fighting in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And he suffered from PTSD. You know, they had all that back then, but their antidote for that was alcohol. And he developed alcoholism, you know. And when he got out of the service after the war, you know, he became an iron worker. And he worked on high steel and all on the East Coast, you know, New York City to Miami. And he had built bridges all over the country. And he married and had 2 daughters, one of which became my wife. And alcoholism had ruined his life, ruined his marriage. And he was divorced, and he was gone from his family for 11 years. At the end of 11 years, he wanted to put his family back. He had gone through an AA program, had become clean and sober, and one of the AA members introduced him to a man who later introduced him to Brother Branham in the message. So he had gone to hear Brother Branham preach, and he knew right away who he was. And so he came back, and he's the one I told you, I saw him on a roof of this burned out church. And it had been struck by lightning. There was a hole in the metal roof, and there was a fire inside, and it was over 100 years old. But I don't know why it never caught fire and burned to the ground, but there was other use for it, apparently. So he, you know, he came and got delivered from alcoholism. He came, and that's how, through him and his efforts, were how the message came to my ears. And he's the one that was holding the tape service when I heard the message Hybrid Religion. And so that's, God used him in his life. And you know, men, you read in a scripture like men like David, King David, and you know, he committed murder on top of lust, but yet he was given a heart that, like the Lord's, and his testimony at the end of his life was that, you know, he was a man after God's own heart. So, you know, there was a recreation in him that brought him to that state. And you know, even when David's life was so messed up that God was still using him, and he wasn't, I don't think David was even consciously aware that he was portraying Christ, but he did. And and I believe that God does that with us. You know, you may not be consciously aware that he is using you, and that your testimony is going out there to others, and you may not even be aware of it, but yet he uses you nonetheless, just like he did King David, even when his life was messed up, you know, and he was paying the consequences of his, you know, his living. God was still using him to portray Christ in his living. And I think he does that with us, you know, and we may not even be consciously aware of it, but it's there nonetheless. So, you know, he means more than my breath to me, you know, and I have a relationship with him that though he would take my breath from me, I would still love him. I hope that would be my testimony.